December 7th, 1906. I have not been able to rid my mind of the look on that woman's face, a wide-eyed dread at first, then a closing, smaller, as if her features were swelling shut, the anger turning her freckles to a deep brown spot at her high forehead, the fear of what is it from? I cannot figure out this cook. I cannot figure out the case. It seems to be getting more confusing to me the further we proceed. Monday morning, cautious and grave, Mr. Soper and I took the elevated train up 6th Avenue to 57th Street, and marched our way to Central Park and over to 5th Avenue, up to the mansion where Mary Mallon works. We rang the bell and said we were from the Department of Health and Sanitation. We know now not to mention our real purpose until we speak with the head of the household. The very pleasant butler showed us to a dazzling parlor, where he asked us to wait while he fetched his employer, but his kindness gave me an eerie feeling. He seemed to be expecting us. Mr. Soper briefly met my eyes in question as we waited. I couldn't help admiring the polished shine of the furniture and the floors and the window glass. I wondered how the disease might come to such an immaculate homes. I did imagine it to survive in places with maids who swept. How did it imagine to survive in places with maids who swept and scrubbed daily? It was easy to see in my own building, where we all lived so close together and can practically feel each other's cough through the walls. But in a large, sparkling house with so few people, how did the bacteria continue to live? The butler returned and said his employer would be down shortly as soon as he finished tending to his wife. Mr. Soper asked what ailed his wife. The butler seemed bewildered. "Didn't you state you were from the Department of Health?" he asked. He thought he'd been summoned by his employer. "We are, in fact, investigating a typhoid epidemic," Mr. Soper answered. "Typhoid, yes," the butler exclaimed, "the same disease that has felled the missus. The daughter was hospitalized with it last night." A gasp slipped from me. It was unprofessional, but I couldn't help it. At that moment, the man of the house came into the parlor and sank into the sofa. He was dressed in his night shoes and gown. He rested his forehead in his hands, and he sighed, "I'm so glad you're here." Mr. Soper sat across from him and said, "My assistant and I are engaged to hunt down the source of a typhoid epidemic that probably began some years ago." "The vomiting started after we took Melissa to the hospital," the man said. "I'm sorry," Mr. Soper said. "I must be clear, I'm not a medical doctor." The man looked up, and Mr. Soper went on, "I'm investigating this epidemic. Our findings have led us here. I believe you've hired a cook named Mary Mallon. We have reason to think she has unwittingly brought the disease to you." "My cook is not ill," the man said. "She never has been." "I understand," Mr. Soper said. "We believe she doesn't need to be ill to carry the typhoid." "I have never heard of such a thing," the man said. "We only ask that she submit to testing at our offices," Mr. Soper said. "But the Bureau says the only sickness she's ever had is a common cold," the man said. Maybe he was distracted by his worry, but the man was very resistant to the idea that his cook carried the typhoid disease, and Mr. Soper insisted we must have a chance to test her. It's the only way to rule her out. "I think you're wasting your time, but if you say you can prevent the spread of disease," the man said. He showed us to the kitchen and introduced us to a tall, flame-haired woman with a knife in her hand and a half-cut onion on the chopping block before her. This was Mary. I could not stop myself from staring at her. In my mind, I had pictured a Medusa, a pox-ridden hag with missing teeth and long, dirty fingernails, crawling with worms. Yet, standing before us was a woman who looked proper and stately, hair in a bun, apron neatly ironed, nails trim and pink. Mr. Soper started telling her we were from the Department of Health and Sanitation in the city of New York, and she resumed to slicing her onion. "My kitchen is clean," she said. There was not a mark on her skin. Not even her collar was starched and brilliant white. "With all respect, Miss Mallon, we have reason to believe that you may be involved in the carriage of typhoid without your knowing it," Mr. Soper said. "What d'you mean I'm involved?" she said. She spoke with a thick Irish brogue. "I ain't been sick a day in my life." I don't mean to poke fun at her accent by writing it this way. I simply want to test the degree to which I can accurately relate the details. Mr. Soper asked her to think over her back history. "I worked for a dozen Loverly families," she said. "What about 'em?" "The disease seems to follow you, doesn't it?" Mr. Soper asked. "Wouldn't you like to know why that is?" She glanced quickly at her employer, who seemed impatient and upset. "Aye, I know why 'tis," she said. "This city's full of sickness, Everywhere you look, there are people dropping with the typhoid and the croup. 'Tain't no surprise, mister. People get sick all the time. Mr. Soper persisted. Yes, but the typhoid in particular seems to follow you, ma'am. If you're not careful, disease can enter the food one prepares, especially raw, uncooked food like peach ice cream. The woman stopped slicing and looked up. Her employer interjected here. Mary is a cleanly person and a fine cook. Of course she washes. I wouldn't hire anyone who wasn't completely scrupulous in every way. This is a waste of time. I must get back to my wife. Please, let me show you the door. Now pause, go back up 2 lines. Scrupulous is one of your words. What does that mean? What did you guess it means? Does it make sense here? And check and see what the real meaning is. Mr. Soper didn't move. Oniony tears watered Mary's eyes. She squinted them away, and she said to Mr. Soper in a bitter voice, You sayin' I ain't clean? We could solve this issue if you simply come to my office and give us a sample of your fluids, Mr. Soper said. His voice softened as he got more frustrated with these stubborn people. My what? The cook just asked quietly. Your fluids, he repeated. What in the world? She started to protest, and my chief interrupted. Your fluids, such as your blood, for example, will tell us if you carry disease. You want blood? She screeched, scaring the life out of me. I feared she had completely lost her mind, shouting that way in front of the master of the house. Mary, please, her employer said. Mr. Soper said, Your blood, yes. She took the knife in hand and stabbed it into the chopping block with a high-pitched yell. I'll give you blood! Her employer turned to us. Mr. Soper, why don't you find the real reason for this typhoid, and for God's sake, instead of upsetting my staff? Mary struggled to remove the knife. The man waved his arms at us. Please, I have to ask you to leave. I have enough problems without your wild accusations. But all I ask for is a small sample. If you don't leave, I'll have to complain to the department. Mary hollered, Get out of here! Out! Out with your foul ideas! Go on! Her eyes rolled up. I could see the whites of them in her teeth. Please, ma'am, it's very important that we test you. She screeched and yanked the knife out of the block and started coming around. Mr. Soper turned on his heel, scooting me out of the house in front of him, and that was the last we spoke to her. A disaster. Not at all what we imagined, this woman. Not in the least. The incident disturbed Mr. Soper profoundly. I found it has put a brick wall in our way. All week he muttered to himself that we must get to her, we must explain to her so she'll understand. I watch him sifting through the records, repeating to himself that we must figure out a way to have her tested, or she will continue spreading the